Good morning. Welcome to AP Computer Science A. Today we are going to cover section 1.3 data types. So you should be able to have this open, your Replit Classroom starter code for this lesson. And don't forget that you want to make sure that you type in your name. So type in your name here. So David Diaz, your name should not be David Diaz. Then don't forget that you want to be able to submit your code once you finish the lesson, so you guys will get full points for this. So let's get started. So let's go and review what we covered on the first two lessons. On the first lesson, we covered how to be able to output to the monitor, correct? To the screen. And the way that we did this is that we know that we want to make sure that we type in the code within your main method. So any code that you type in for now will be here. Outside, later on, we're going to type in some variable fields. But for now, everything that you type in should be within your main method. And to be able to output something to the screen, we're going to say system.out.print ln, and we talked about the difference between print and println, correct? Do you remember? Correct. Println will give you a return once it prints whatever is being printed, or whatever you type in here. In this case, we're going to say hello world, and that is what we learned last time. We also remember that we need to make sure that we end every statement with a semicolon. And then we run it, and if there are no errors, it's going to compile, and now it outputs hello world into our screen. So that's what we learned on section 1.1. Now on section 1.2, we were starting to get input from the user, but we know that Java doesn't have that integrated within the main package. So therefore, we must use an import statement, and your import statement must be outside the class definition. So it'll be import java.util.scanner. That's going to import the class scanner. That's going to allow you to be able to get input from the user, whether it's a keyboard, a file, but for now we're going to keep it as a keyboard. So now let's go and get rid of this line for now. We'll come back to put into the monitor in a few minutes. So we know that before we can actually get the input, we need to be able to type in the following: scan equals new scanner, then system.in. You want to make sure that you memorize that line. That is going to allow you to be able to use the keyword scan to be able to get input from the user, and scan is it's a variable. We'll talk about more or data types and variables today. Then from there, we can just get input from the user, and we can actually just say, if we want, we can just say scan.next line. Remember that next line is going to give you ability to be able to get something from the keyboard. So we run it, and it says error. What is my error? Oh, they have 3 N's in there. You guys didn't tell me there were 3 N's. There you go. So any little errors that you guys have in there, notice that it's going to tell you that there's an error, and it's going to even tell you where it is. Now sometimes it's going to be very easy to tell. Sometimes you got to you'll get some more experience to be able to determine where the errors are. So now let's go and run it. So what type of error is that? That is a syntax error, because whenever it compiles, it automatically checks to see if everything's correct, and you'll get syntax errors there. So now I can get and say David. So I was able to type something in, but then we're not doing anything with this. First, we're not even asking the user to be able to tell the user what they need to type in. So let's go and tell the user to say system.out, and let me just place an extra line in here. System.out print ln. And what is your name? Don't forget to end with a semicolon every single time. And now we can actually run it. And I can type in, what is your name? David. Now, I'm typing in David, but you're not saving anything, David, anywhere. So that's why we need to be able to first do two things. We're going to declare, and then we're going to initialize. So we're going to do that in two statements. First, we are typing in a word, so we have to type in string, and then we have to give it a name, a variable name. It can be name, it can be student, it can be teacher. But in this case, we're just going to say name. If it has to be something meaningful, and now this is going to allow me to type in something, and that is going to declare it, and now I'm going to catch it with name. So, and we're doing this in two statements, correct? This is called a declaring the statement, and then we're going to initialize it. So we're going to tell it what type of statement it is. It's going to be a string. Then whatever you type in this line, that is going to be stored in name. So let's go and run it. What is your name? David. Now, name is holding whatever the user typed in this case, David. And now I'm going to press enter. But now we're not doing anything with it, right? So therefore, now let's go ahead and use what we typed in. And we're going to say system.out.println hello space plus name. Do you remember what the plus does to? What is the plus? What does it do? The plus is going to connect them. And what do we call when we connect two strings? Concatenation. So you have to be able to remember that for the test. Concatenation is basically the process of connecting two strings. Now we're connecting two types of strings. We are connecting a literal string, because that's in quotation marks, and we're connecting a variable string, because that's a variable, and the reason that's a variable is because it can change. So let's say if I want to be able to have, let's say, please system.out.println enter your real name, and then I repeat the process. Now I don't, and we'll talk about this in a second, I'm not going to declare it again. I'm just going to use it equals scan the next line, and then I'm going to repeat that statement, system.out.println hello plus name. So let's go and run it. And first it's going to ask me for if I did not make any errors, no syntax errors, which is perfect. So therefore it'll be David. Hello David, enter your real name. Okay, Diaz. So notice that in this case, it's called a variable because it changes, correct? It goes from name, first it was David, and now it is Diaz. So that's why it's called a variable. And remember, the plus, what does the plus do? The plus will connect them. So now let's go and say that we want to be able to ask them their first name and their nickname. But we want to be able to store them in two separate strings, in two separate variables. So let's say, what is your name? And let's not go and print anything yet, so let's go and get rid of this line here. And then we're going to say, what is your nickname? So now we don't want to store it in name, correct? We want to be able to create a new variable So that way we can store that whatever they type in next. So therefore, since we need to store a new variable, we're going to say string, and let's go and say nickname. You want to make sure that you use variables that are meaningful. So whenever someone else reads your program, they know what you are typing or what that corresponds to. So they're going to say nickname. Now, this is a little hard to read because two words are connected. So what we do, we actually place the second word with an initial uppercase, because now it's going to be much easier to read. You do see that, right? And now that is called camel case. And that is in your notes. Make sure that you read it carefully. Camel case is whenever the second word, the initial first letter, it's an uppercase, and that's just to be able to provide a little more really easy to read to your program. And now we're going to catch it and say nickname. So therefore, the first time the user types in something, it's going to be stored in name. And whenever they enter their nickname, now it's going to be stored in nickname. So that way you have two keys of information that you did not replace. Before, one of them was replacing the other. So we lost the first one. And now we're going to say, hello, David. Also known as, I'm going to place a comma, or known as, and then my nickname, or the user's nickname. Remember that if you by any chance misspell this, those are two separate variables. Java is not going to know that they're actually the same. So uppercase does matter. And now if I want a period at the very end or an exclamation point, I need to make sure that I do another plus. I'm going to concatenate again. I'm going to connect them with an exclamation point. And now it's set. So therefore, it's going to ask for the name, it's going to declare a variable, and then it's going to initialize it. So we are doing it in 2 lines. Today, we're going to make it a little shorter. And now ask for the nickname, and let's go and run it and see what happens. Tell, what is your name? My name is David. What is your nickname? My nickname is Pepe. Actually, my first name is Jose, so therefore when I was a young guy, a young boy, even in my teens, they call me Pepito. So therefore, hello David, known as Pepito. So therefore, that is what we learned last time. But now we are talking about camel case. We are talking about making sure that we have two separate variables. Now, what if we want to be able to ask the user for their name? Well, let's go back. Let's go and talk about your variable names. If you have your notes, you'll want to make sure that you read this carefully, because variable names must start with a letter or an underscore, but we usually don't start with an underscore because it's a little harder to read. They can use some symbols, but not others. So therefore, we avoid any symbols, even dollar signs, question marks, and percentages cannot be used. So therefore, we try to avoid any symbols whenever you are naming a variable. Now, there's some keywords that you guys are not able to use, such as the following keywords. Any of those keywords you guys are not able to use as a variable name. So you can't say finally, you can't say volatile, while. Those are not variable names that you can use. Now, one of the things that we talked about is the difference between declaring a variable. That is declaring a variable. This line here is called declaring a variable. The next one is initializing the variable. So declaring the variable versus initializing your variable, that's what you're going to be storing. But let's talk about data types first. Before we actually go into final values, let's talk about data types. There can be different type of data types that we can use. The only ones that we've used so far are strings. But what if you want to be able to get a number from a user? Now, in AP Computer Science Principle, you guys learn about binaries, right? And you guys learn about bits, a byte, integer. So a byte is made up of 8 bits. Do you remember what is a bit? So in this case, And do you guys remember doing a flippy do in AP Computer Science Print? So if you took computer science principles, you can cover binaries. If you did not take computer science principles, don't worry. I'll place a little link on the video, on the assignment, so that way if you are interested, you can just watch it through, because that will take me an entire week to be able to go through. And this is not computer science principles, this is computer science A. But we remember that a byte is made out of 8 bits. Each bit is made of, so computers only save zeros and ones. That's how they save all the information. So if you actually look into a computer, it's going to be just on or off, correct? That's what's called binary, either on or off. So in this case, if we want to be able to enter the number 0, this is the number 0 in binary. Then it can be only 0, 1. So therefore the number 1 is, this is the number 1. Do you remember why it's the number 2? Not. So for example, in our number system, it goes from 0 to 9. What happens after we get to 9? There's no one single digit for the next one, right? So what we do, we go increase this one by 1 and make this a 0. So that is a 2. Then a 3. That once we need a 4, we can't make that higher than 1. So what do we do? To make it 4, we make this a 1. That is 0, and that is 0. That's a 4. What is a 5? That is a 5. We can make that higher, so therefore we go over here. That is a 6. What is a 7? That is a 7. So what is an 8? Because I can increase that one to 1, higher than 1. I can increase the next one higher than 1. I can increase the next one. So an 8 will be 1, 0, 0, 0, and so on. But then last year, you guys learned it this way, where an 8 was over here, 2 to the 3rd power. That's another way of thinking, depending on how you want to think about it. You can actually add binaries, but that's going to take me an extra week, which we're not going to cover. But you do need to be able to remember the following. You need to be able to remember that a byte is 8 bits. We're not going to be using bytes in Java. Then we have a short, can also store an integer. An int is the one that we're going to be, so if you guys can highlight an int is going to be giving you guys from this number to this number. I won't say it because it's too high. Now, a byte, you might want to say, well, how come we only use an integer? Because a byte, you have to make sure that you are only using values between negative 128 and 127. Which most of the time we use larger numbers. A short might be sufficient, but we don't want to risk getting errors. So therefore, we are going to be using an int. Long is going to be bigger than an int, but we usually don't need such large numbers. Now, if we need a decimal, we are going to be using a float or a double. In Java, we're going to be using a double. So we're going to be using int and a double. Char, we're going to use a char once in a while, not as much. It's not tested on the APCSA. And a boolean will be either true or false. Yes or no. And that's going to help us make decisions in Java. So one of the things that you have to remember is that if you want to be able to get an integer, now you do remember what an integer is, right? If you want to be able to use an integer, you have to use int. If you want to be able to use a decimal, you have to use double. If you want to be able to use only a single character, which we're not going to use as much, a char. And boolean, we're going to be using that on the next unit 2 or 3. And now, one of the things you want to be able to count, take this visualization of each one. So therefore, if we're going to use a double, notice how much more space it's going to require. So therefore, if you don't need a decimal, don't use a double. If you know that you're going to need a whole number, use an integer. So you're going to use a boolean, an integer, or a double. And you're going to say, well, how about strings, Mr. Diaz? We've been using strings. The strings are what we call non-primitives. These ones are the primitive types, and we'll talk about more on that on the next lesson. So don't worry about the primitive and non-primitive for now. If you're going to use if you want to be able to, for people to type in letters, words, we use a string. If you want to use a whole number, we use a int. If you want to use a decimal, we use a double. So highlight, make local notes for yourselves. So let's go back to the lesson. So now let's assume that we want to be able to get the age. I know. Let's talk about the age. So let's go and go back over here. We want to be able to get the name. And now we want to say, what is your age? So let's go and change this to age. We don't want nickname any longer. We're going to say age. And I should place question marks at the very end as well. Then we want to be able to just say, it's not going to be no longer a string, right? Because we want to be able to make calculations. If you make it as a string, it's still going to get accepted, but then you won't be able to use it as a number. So there we're going to say int, and we're going to give it a variable name, which is age. And that's no longer a camel case, so we can delete this. And now we are going to have it as age. But now, next line is going to give us a string. We cannot use next line if that is an int. So therefore, what we need to go, if you go beyond your notes, this, and this is our illustrations of, we'll come back to this part once we start to do more operations with doubles in the next two sections. Strings are also called reference data types, but we'll go over that in the next few sections. So therefore, if you want to be able to get a number from the screen, and if you're going to have it as an int, you have to use next int. So highlight the ones that you need. You need next line if you're going to get a string or a word, next int if you're going to get a whole number, and next double if you're going to get a decimal. So that has to correspond to your variable type. This is a variable type, it's an integer. This is the variable name. It's age. We decided because that's going to tell us what it is. And now instead of next line, it's going to have to be next int. So therefore, I'm going to go and print, hello, David, or hello, name. You are, your age is, and then we're going to make sure. Now, if you're running right now, look what happens if I don't change that to, because that's never been used, it's never been declared, we're going to get an error. So now if you run it, let's check and see, notice that it gives us an error because it doesn't know what nickname is. So therefore we want to make sure that we use age. And now let's go and run it. What is your name? My name is David. How old are you? 47. Hello David, your age is 47. So, and then we can do other calculations, but we won't do that until later with the integer. Where with strings, we can't add them, we can't multiply them. We want to make sure that we use integers for numbers. So let's assume that we actually are going to run it. Let me run it once again with the same information, nothing changed. And let's say the user says your name is David. And what is your age? Well, my birthday is on October, so I would say that's a 47.8. This gives you an error because the computer, Java, was expecting an integer, but the user typed in a whole number. So therefore, if you think the user is going to be typing in, we can say approximate in approximate decimal form. If we're expecting a decimal, we're going to use double. And now if I run it, what is your name? David. Decimal form 47.8. Oh, oh, what happened? I messed up again. What did I do wrong? Can anybody catch my mistake? Did you catch it? Pause it. See what I made a mistake. Correct. So in this case, my mistake was that this, because I'm using a double, I can't use a double. I must use a next double. So you want to make sure that you are careful. So therefore, because I'm using a double now, this has to be next double. And now let's try once again. So what is your name? My name is David. How old are you, David? 47.8. And now it works. Now you might want to say, well, can I just use the double every single time? No. Because once we go into the next few sections, we're going to see what is the challenge with using a double every single time. Well, let's say I enter, let me run it again. I want to just enter 47. So what is my name? David. Age is 47. So notice that one of the problems is that whenever it prints 47.0. There's other ways to be able to fix that, but if you are expecting a whole number, an integer, you have to make sure you use int. If you're expecting a double, a decimal, make sure that you use double. Any questions? Excellent. So let's go over the last things about your notes that you want to make sure that you read through this. Highlight the ones that you need. You need next line if you're going to get a string from the user. Next int if you're going to use an integer. Next double if you're going to use a decimal. Notice if they type in the wrong thing, that's going to give you an error. So if you're expecting an integer but they type in cat, that's going to give you an error. If you're expecting an integer and get a decimal, that's going to give you an error. But if you are expecting a double and they enter an integer, that's fine. And we can talk about the size. So if you are expecting a double, but they enter an integer, there's enough space for the integers to fit here, correct? So that will fit. The problem is that if you have an integer and they type in a double, there's not enough bits for that to fit into an integer. So we'll talk about that in class. So be careful. That will not give you an error. So make sure, two more things that I need to talk about. Now, we've been doing this in two lines. We are declaring it and then initialize it. What if we actually can save some time and then extra time? We can actually do this in one line. We can initialize it and declare it and initialize it at the same time. So that's what we're going to start doing from now on. But this other way, the way that we started with, is going to allow us to be able to talk more once we talk about memory. So that's usually how I type it, and you guys probably have seen me in class, and you say, hold on, Diaz, you're getting me confused now. So I prefer if you guys declare it and initialize at the same time instead of just doing it two lines from now on. The last things that we need to do. If you have a number that's not going to change at all, so you have a number that we know that is not going to change, such as pi, then we make those as final and we use uppercase. So in case you see something in uppercase, we know that has to be a final that should not be changed. Now if you include the word final, there's no way for you to change it. So that's why we usually do include the word final. And last is of your notes. In some of our exercises, we are going to need the following code: integer.max value. So let's go and type that in. So let's say the enter name and said, no, I'm going to overwrite it. I'll say the age is equal to integer.max value. That's going to give you the biggest value that we have in integers. And you remember what is the value? No, because we just saw, we didn't even read it. The largest value that we have for integers is here. So 2,147,487,647. So if we actually print it and we run it, says, what is my name? David. How old are you? I'm 47. Nope. And notice that it gives it to you in exponential form. And that's because, oh, it's actually, that's because we have H as an integer. So let me just go back and say I want it as an integer. What is your name? David. Age 48, 47, and now that will be your output. That is the largest number that it should provide. And let me double check that I have it correct here. And there you go, it should match. So email me if you have any questions. Have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time.